Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the e-discovery channel. I'm recovering from all the chocolate I ate last night, day after Halloween, um, and uh, Doug and I are both recovering from our very spooky EDRM case law webinar yesterday, which was a good one, and actually had, I think, three cases that are directly on point for what we're talking about here today, which is hyperlink attachments. Um, and to that end, we're really pleased to have with us Arman Gungor. Did I say that right, Arman?
That's right. Thank you.
All right. Arman's the CEO of Metaspike, which is a digital forensic software company. But for purposes of our discussion, and the reason we wanted him here, um, does a lot of deep dive into Google Suites, Google Mail, and all the problems that Gmail and hyperlink attachments may crop up. Arman, thanks for joining us. First of all, um, we've had several interviews with people who are uh, Microsoft slash M365 slash Purview experts, and so we've done kind of a deep dive into what that does. But the one that keeps coming up, of course, is Gmail, in especially as I mentioned, we had a case yesterday. The first case that we talked about yesterday, which was, I have the site right here, um, UAB Planner 5D versus Meta Platforms, in which Meta made an objection to the production of documents, saying that and I noted it during the webinar, and I'll say it again. This has become the boilerplate objection, I think, of the 21st century. First, hyperlink attachments aren't attachments, so we don't have to do them. Second, they're difficult, if not impossible, to get to. Third, if we could get to them, it's a lengthy, time-consuming process, which would be extremely expensive. Then there was a deep pause in their pleadings, and then the next paragraph they said, but after we looked at them, we found that they were neither relevant or they were covered by the attorney-client privilege. So they're impossible to get to, but after we got to them, they weren't relevant.
Them. Right, yes.
Yeah. So that sort of argument is making people like me and Doug tear what remaining hair we have out. I got the receding hairline. I can't afford to rip any more out. And so, Arman, that's really what we're looking at, is the focus on G Suite. I understand you actually have a product you built called FEC, Forensics Email Collector. Is that right?
Forensic Email Collector, yes.
Yeah. So tell me, if I came to you, if I were a client who called you up and said, look, I'm involved in litigation, I got to produce my email, I use G Suites and Gmail exclusively, goes back like 10 years, and I know in some of those emails I've got hyperlinks to documents instead of attaching them to the email. I said, take a look at this document, with a link to the document on our system, and I understand that's going to be a problem. Is it going to be? What do I need to do? Well, actually, what I need to do is give it to you and let you talk to the judge. But if the judge asks, how difficult is it? And then secondarily, after we talk about that, a question I think Doug wanted to make sure we got to is, what should I do going forward? If I'm a Gmail person, what steps should I take in terms of my archiving going forward with anything that's a hyperlink? So the floor is yours, because honestly, I don't know anything about how Gmail works. So.
All right. Well, thank you. Happy to be here, first of all. I think I'll approach this in two main categories, because there are issues about doing this for individuals and small scale productions. Yeah. And then there's a whole set of separate issues when you scale this up and deal with larger corporations where there's vault involved and multiple people, thousands of mailboxes, and there's challenges that are specific to that. But as far as scope goes, you were mentioning, some people raise the objection that hyperlinked attachments are not attachments and they may not be relevant. But this is, if you think about it, it's nothing new, because you could always have an email where there's a hyperlinked at a minimum image. For example, let's say I compose an email, I make a screenshot of a financial document like a profit and loss statement, I embed that into my email as a hyperlinked image. Then you send it off to somebody. Right there, you have a hyperlinked attachment, essentially, that points to some outside external document. So it's hard to object that that is not part of the email. It is definitely part of the context. But
Oh, it's not
when,
that hard for them to object. It's not part of the email.
oh yes,
They do it quite easily.
yeah. So when we approach this on a small scale, the process is fairly straightforward because if you scan the email and get a list of the, or even a calendar event and get a list of the relevant Google document, Google Docs that are linked, then you have their identifiers right there, and you can go out to Google Drive API and fetch them. And again, you can go to Google Drive API and get the versions of them, which is the revision information. And a lot of
Now,
times it's just
let me interrupt. When you say you can do that, do you literally mean you can do that? Um,
anybody can do it. Drive
if I'm
API.
a solo attorney who just recently converted from my AOL.com email, um, and you laugh, however, especially in the solo attorney and attorneys who do a lot of criminal representation, um, there is a very low level of technical expertise. But you're
No,
saying
no, let's be
with the
clear
doc
there.
ID number, there's an API that lets you just go and get it.
There's an API, but this is essentially, I'm talking about a technical proof of concept. So to actually implement that, there's a lot of detail to get it right.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't expect, an attorney or even an ordinary discovery practitioner to implement that for any case. It's an
So their
undertaking
best advice is to
to
call
get that.
you.
Yeah, there's definitely a process. Somebody could develop something like this in-house. It's not rocket science. Or if it's a very small scale request, like there's just one file and you want to get the revisions of that, and the API is there and they have a playground there. So even a not very technical person could do it at an individual scale. But when you get into thousands of emails and hundreds of thousands of files, then there's a lot of challenges associated with that. But from a
And I'm
concept,
sorry to keep interrupting, but in the case that I referenced yesterday, they were discussing 45,000 documents.
mhm.
Pretty easy to do.
Well, once you have 45,000 documents, you have to automate it at that point. So you have to have either a tool or you have to have a development team that'll actually, sort that out and test it, debug it, and get to a point where it's working right. So it's not just like a one-off thing where they can just play with the
So 10 or
Google
12
API code.
documents, no big deal. 45,000, you need a
Yeah,
tool.
automation is severely needed at that point. But
Okay.
from a technical feasibility standpoint, it's very feasible. The API is there, the documentation is there, and the task is clear. Find the identifier, fetch the drive file, get the revisions, and then there you are. And for an
Can I
individual
ask,
person,
can I ask you a question? When you say revisions, what do you mean? Because that's one of the things that we really tried to drill into in an understanding in terms of what you can do with Google Drive files. When you say revisions, can you actually get to the version of the file from prior time, or is it just a list of revisions, or what is it exactly?
Yeah.
well, we
So
started.
let's say I sent an email to Doug a year ago,
Mhm.
and it's a document, and Doug wants to make a revision. He sends it back to me. I make a revision. It's in a hyperlink. What what is the API getting for us? The most recent one, the first one, all the ones in between.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's good to clear that up right away. So when you talk to Drive API and you request a file, so I'm not talking about revisions now, then you get the current version of the file. And in the case of email, the email is in the past, but the file continues to live on. So the current version of the file may not be congruent with what was sent back in the day. So that's what Drive API gets when you request a file. Now, in addition to that, you can request the revisions of a file and a list of that. So the list gets you metadata about what snapshots Google Drive has about the file and their authors, dates, and things of that nature. So the
So,
idea there,
and I'm again sorry to interrupt. Is that a list that Google is generating, or that's in the metadata of the document? There's a revision
Log
history
or
or
something,
track.
right?
no, the Google Drive API has this internal. So in their database for file A, they have a list of revisions, right? And
Wow.
revision 1 is from this date, revision 2 is this date. So they give you that list when you ask for it. And that's usually the starting point for us because we want to know what list of
Right.
revisions there are so we can
Right.
ask for them, number one. And in
Nice.
other cases where people are interested in only a specific revision, usually that's the revision that's right before the sent date of the parent email, then we
Right.
know to ask for just that one revision to pinpoint exactly what is needed. So the good news there is that the API is there, technical feasibility is there. It's fairly straightforward to get there. And when
And
you
again, sorry to keep interrupting, but that's the sort of guy I am. What if that link is to an internal DMS, not to Google Suite? In other words, you're not depending on Google to have it. What if it's a document management system? Can you pull from that?
Well, that's a
Or-
whole different ballgame at that point, because you're not talking about Google
Right.
Drive API or anything like that. And another derivative of this is this: you might be dealing with an email, but what if the email has links from Google Drive and OneDrive and Box.com and Dropbox, or any
Yeah.
combination
Yeah.
of those?
Can you
So
go
you
and
might,
get those, or is that
you would have to deal with them separately. So you would have to have a
Right.
process that
Different
deals with Google
API,
Drive.
right?
You would have to deal with a process. You would have to have a process for Box.com. Like, all those things would have to come together. Fortunately, that's kind of rare. Not everybody throws like all these mixture of links in there, but they would have to be dealt with separately. And same thing, even more challenging for the internal document management systems, because then as an external developer, we would know little about what you have in house. And that's harder for us to solve unless we have a specific task and engagement to really deal with that.
the
So
good
for
news
now,
there
Arman,
is?
so
I'm sorry.
Arman can ask a clarifying question on the revisions. So what I'm trying to understand is, you're getting the document, let's say, like in Tom's scenario, there's been a few revisions since the original email was sent. So you're getting the document as it stands now and a list of revisions that have happened. So you're not necessarily getting Google doesn't give you the file as it existed at that time, but you can use the revision history to kind of essentially understand what's changed. Is that the best way of putting it?
that's right. So there's no way to ask Google, hey, here I have an email, give me the attachment that should go with this. There's no API for that specific.
Gotcha.
But if you
Okay,
know how
that's
to
what I
ask,
thought.
then essentially you can leverage the list of revisions, and you know the date of the email, and you get a list of the dates of the revisions. You can kind of, surmise from there what revision should have gone with that email, and you can ask for that specifically, and you get there. But it would have been nice if, for each email, or at least each Gmail email, if they kept a note of a specific revision for that email and allowed you to ask for that specifically, that would have been nice. But yeah, there's no
Sure.
API like that for
Right.
now.
Well, but that still is more than I realized that Google was tracking, because I didn't think they were tracking the revisions at all. So
Right.
at least you've got some information that you could get back to what what the file had or looked like at the time, even if you don't get exactly that exact version of the file. You have information that tells you what's changed since, so you can make some intelligent decisions. So that's good to know.
And
Yeah,
it's
you can
also
get
good
back
to
to
know
it.
if you're arguing to the court, right? Hey, Your Honor, this is what we got, but look, Google shows there were 9 revisions here. And, one of the problems we have here, Arman, is that we get these very high level arguments where people are not discussing in enough detail what they want and why they want it. So that sort of information would be very useful to be able to tell the court, Your Honor, we're not just asking for something out of the blue. Look, at this document had 5 revisions, 10 revisions, whatever, over a 10-month period, and we'd like to focus in on the 5 earliest of those, or whatever. It just gives the court something to hang its hat on when the producing party says, "Oh, you can't do that. That's just not there." So that's great info. Yeah, I had no idea they had that much detail available.
They have the revision information, and that's actually, in my experience dealing with our clients, that's usually what's required. A lot of times people want to
Yeah.
get to that specific revision so that they can show
Exactly.
what email was sent. So that's the main use case in our service. People either want all the revisions in rare cases, or most of the time they want that one revision that correlates with the sent date
Yeah.
of the email. So API allows that in a roundabout way, which is good. And when we deal with an individual person, then there is no, permission problems and stuff most of the time, because we're dealing with a single person, and that person, whatever files they own, they have the full rights to get their revisions and the file itself. There's one aspect of this that's kind of interesting. And that is when you start off with the hyperlinks rather than Google Drive directly, then you might have hyperlinks coming from anywhere. So let's say I'm collecting Tom's mailbox, right? Well, in Tom's mailbox, there might be Google Drive hyperlinks that are coming from Jim's mailbox from someplace else.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, good
So
point.
you
Good
don't
point.
have to specifically deal with that in this scenario, because as long as the person that you authenticated as has the permissions to access that file, so they've been given that permission to download the file or access its revisions, let's say, then you're good. So we don't have to worry about the source information too much. We do capture it as metadata, of course, but that's one of the benefits. So it doesn't matter if it's originated from that drive or somebody else's drive or wherever it came from, it's going to be part of the modern attachment collection for that file.
If
Now,
I didn't have rights to one of those links, could you still see the revision list?
No, Drive API, not authenticated as you. So if it's Jim's file and you're just a viewer, then I would have to go and authenticate as Jim so that I could get the revisions of that file.
Right.
And
So,
that is the
so that,
complication
right.
we'll talk about when we get into the corporate stuff.
Then
That's-
yeah, just
Well,
that.
yeah, because I was going to say what I could see a scenario where maybe you had initial rights to the file and then the rights were revoked. So at the time you're collecting, that's when So,
Yeah.
but the thing is, it's good to know that as long as they have rights to the file, even if it is in some other person's set of data, you can still go and get it, assuming they have the rights. So
There's
that's good to
essentially
know.
two main part of rights to talk about here. One of them is when you access the Google Drive file, not the revision. I call that the Google Drive attachment. Then you would have the authenticated user would have to have the right to download the file, because you could be shared the file just as a viewer without the download permission.
Sure.
And if you don't have that right, you couldn't even download it through Google Drive's web interface. So if you have that permission, then you can actually download the file as it sits now. And then when you want to get into revisions, then you have to have a higher level of permission there. You have to be either an editor of the file or you have to be the owner or one of the owners of the file. So
Gotcha.
that complicates things a little bit in terms of revisions when you deal with other people's files. When you deal with your own files or the custodian's own files, then things are fairly straightforward there. I
What
would say there-
happens? I'm sorry again. Does Google have a counterpart to Teams? Is there a collaborative tool in the Google suite?
Well, Google Hangouts might be considered something like that, not exactly as Teams, maybe a combination
I'm
of
just thinking of
Google-
a time where, as in Teams, I can share the document with the 5 people on the team, and everybody does have the rights to get at it. Is there Hangouts would be the closest?
I believe so. They had Google Meet. Their names keep changing, but they had Google Meet, and then there's Hangout now. I don't know what the latest is in terms of the collaboration aspect goes. But in any case, yeah, if you have the hyperlink and if the person has the right wherever the document was
It's
shared,
the
or
rights.
came
No
from,
matter where it comes from, it's the rights.
yeah,
Okay.
the source doesn't matter.
So now what happens when Tom isn't a solo guy? Tom's a member of the Acme Fireworks Company with
Well,
5.
let's finish the individual person first, because
Oh,
there are
you got more. All right. All
couple
right.
of challenges there. One of them
All right.
is, in addition to sharing a file, people can also share a folder in an email, right? You don't have to share an individual file. What if you share a folder or hyperlink a folder and put it on there? So that's one of the challenges. I would say we found a way to deal with that gracefully. If you enable an option, we essentially recursively scan that folder and whatever's in there until we hit the bottom, we make that all part of the attachment set for that email. But it's kind of a double-edged sword, because then what if somebody shared the root of their drive and there's 200,000 files on there totaling terabytes of data. So that's something to deal with caution. I wouldn't make it my standard operating procedure to add all the folders blindly. It's probably best to do like a 2-pass process where you identify the folders, which we do. And then if there's a folder that's of interest, then you go dig into that as needed. But if you just try to bring them all in right off the bat, then that could be a long acquisition. So that's one, a lot of people probably don't think of that. So
Great point. Yeah.
Yeah.
The
No,
second
I
thing
didn't.
is the API limitations, or essentially what the corporations are getting at as far as the feasibility goes in practice. And that is, especially when you deal with Google's own documents, which intuitively you might think otherwise, but Google's own documents are more difficult to deal with, in my experience, because they are presumably to Google, they are database records. There's no actual materialized physical file there. So when somebody shares a PDF, there's a real PDF on the back end, and Google can just channel that in. But when somebody creates a Google Slides or a Google Sheets document, then it's a combination of several records and metadata. But when you want the file, you can't get it as a Google Sheet. You want to turn it into something that eDiscovery tools will work with, kind of like an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document. And when you request that, then they have to do some type of transformation to materialize that file. This has some interesting side effects.
It's a Halloween thing. They have to do a magic transformation.
Yeah, exactly. One of the side effects of this is the API doesn't have information about such files, such as file size or hash, for example, because there is no real file. So until you materialize it, you don't know what you're going to get. So that makes some things a little bit different. But the other downside is because of this extra process, presumably, this is more computationally expensive to them. So there's a lot of, rate limiting and throttling in place. And there's actually API caps that don't even allow you to export files. They have an export method that allows you to export a file directly. I think for Google native documents, that's set at a very low number, something like 10 megabytes or something. So when that doesn't work, you have to revert to a fallback mechanism to get them through other channels. So the bottom line is it's not super fast to get these Google native docs on their revisions. So there's definitely an extra process there. And it's probably even more difficult than downloading emails, because again, emails are easy to just export as MIME, whereas when you request a spreadsheet, it has to be really built up with all its components.
Arman,
go ahead. No, go ahead, Doug. Go ahead.
So I have an email and it's got a link to maybe a Google Doc and a Google Sheet and a Google Slides file. What the person's gonna get as output is the email for the Google from Google Mail, and they're going to get a Google Doc converted into Word, a Google Sheet converted into Excel, and a Google Slide converted into PowerPoint. Is that essentially what they're getting?
That's right. That's customizable to an extent. Google API allows a few different formats for these files.
Right.
They would allow you to PDF it. They would allow you to, get an HTML for some formats.
Yeah, because if you're on the site, you've got the ability to download it and it puts it into that form.
Yeah, you can get an open office version and a Microsoft version. Typically in the Discovery world, most people want the Microsoft versions of these files. So that's what we do internally. But that is something customizable. But in any case, there is definitely some conversion process there, as you can imagine. So this is not an insurmountable issue, because Google APIs are well designed and they communicate with you clearly as you make these requests, and then you run afoul of their API and rate limits. They give you even timestamps. They say something like, we want you to wait until this time comes, and we listen for those and put a delay there until we get there. We try multiple times. So there's a lot of ways to work around and actually get it done. So it's not like something airs out and you're stuck. Like the process continues and eventually it's done. But it is something that, if you're getting into a case like this, something that you should allocate some extra time for. If you're dealing with revisions or Google Drive attachments, it's not super fast as one might initially expect. So those are the two issues I would say that would come up when you deal with an individual person. Now,
and is that, I'm sorry, my thought was, is that just because Google has a different philosophy about handling documents than Microsoft does? It's just a conceptual or an underlying architecture?
I would say it's a fact of life, because running that API costs them, right? It costs them real money, and they have a large number of users to serve. So whoever designs an API like that, they have to implement some type of process to keep it safe and prevent somebody from not only abusing it, but even legitimately, making too many requests that'll slow down the service. So that download process has a cost to them, and because of that, they regulate it strictly, so you can't really go too fast. Now, the fact that they store the documents in their own proprietary format versus something that's a native document ready to download, that's definitely a design choice, but I think one that makes sense, because imagine that if they store the documents on the back end as an Excel spreadsheet, right? I don't know how their system works, but I can imagine that something like that would make things like collaboration very difficult, because then they would have one physical file on the back end, and then what if 10 people are trying to write to it at the same time? It's not designed for something like that. So they have to have their own secret sauce there to manage all that. And then when it's done and you want the file, they just export it for you. So
Sure.
I think what they did makes perfect sense, but the side
Mhm.
effect is there's some cost involved in getting it to materialize. in the
Sure.
end.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I would theorize it's probably when you look at Microsoft versus Google, it's how they came about. I mean, Microsoft originated as an on-prem solution with on-prem files and what have you. Google was always a cloud-based solution with cloud-based files and email in the cloud and what have you. So I kind of feel like maybe that's a big part of why they work differently and why you have to have that conversion process when you want to export from the Google Docs and Sheets and slides and what have you. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's right. I think there's definitely a difference in how the services came about historically. That's true. So that's for a single person or a small group of custodians, like in a small scale, civil litigation, let's say, or criminal case. But when you scale this up to a corporation and you're targeting a large organization, then things change a little bit. Number one, in terms of authentication, because when you target a large organization, you're not going to authenticate individually against people. So then what we use is called domain-wide delegation for Google. So essentially, you bring in a service account that gets authenticated at the organization level for specific permissions, let's say, and that service account can access the Google Drive files or emails or calendar events and stuff. But there's one thing there that throws a lot of people off. When you perform that kind of authentication, intuitively, a lot of people think that, okay, we have a service account that has access to the whole organization. So that's like almost like an admin account, you would assume, that can access anything, right? So that's great. We're all set. But in practice, the way Google implemented this is that service account can only be one person at a time. So it doesn't have the superpower of being anyone at any time or at a specific time. You impersonate a specific person at one time. So when let's say that they have a large corporation and one of the individuals there is Doug, for example, I'm going to acquire Doug's mailbox now. So when I use my service account to target Doug's mailbox, then the service account is impersonating Doug at that moment. So then, as such, it can only access Doug's own revisions or any files that Doug has access to as an individual. If Jim is in the same organization and he has access to some files that Doug doesn't, that service account at that point in time can't access Jim's files because it's not being Jim at that moment. So that's kind of hard to wrap your head around perhaps initially because it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I can see why they would design it like that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you get around that?
So, if you are running a large scale collection and you're collecting Doug's emails and Jim's emails anyway, then you're good because when you target Doug's mailbox, we get your files. When you target his, we get his files. So you get everything. But when you're dealing with individual people and not the whole organization, then you have to account for it. And if you're running into any permission issues like that you couldn't get, then you would have to go and target that file specifically, impersonating that one person that you need. So that's one wrinkle there.
That's so one of the other cases we had yesterday was a huge argument over should we get 40 custodians? No, we don't want to go. They were arguing 60 custodians, 40, 50. And I was thinking to myself, we had a discussion about this is just a big numbers argument. But given what you're saying, if that was a G Suites account, that could be a real pain in the butt. Each one of those poses a problematic barrier, if you will. The difference between 25 and 60 could be enormous.
That's right. The second issue there that could potentially come up is what if you have drive links coming from various sources? So you have drive links, maybe that came up in prior discovery and you just have the links or drive IDs of files, but they're not really in emails, or you collected them from Teams or Slack or somewhere like that. And maybe you know the custodian for each link and you have the link, but you want a specific revision for that link, right? Or for the drive ID. So that's something we've tackled too with our differential acquisition solution, where you can target a specific drive ID and pass along a target date, and pinpoint the revision to get that. But there are still some complications there. One enhancement we're trying to make there is, what if you know the custodian for each link and the date? How do you switch your service account to target a specific person per link, right? So I have 10,000 links. I know that link 1 is for Tom, link 2 is for Doug, link 3 is for Jim. When I'm running my acquisition, for drive 1, I want my service account to impersonate Doug and then switch over to Tom and switch over to Jim as needed, which is not that difficult to do. It's something we already do for our, we have a free mailbox remediation tool that deletes emails, and it does exactly that for email remediation. So we'll implement something similar for FEC to do that, like service account switching, to be able to target a different user as needed. But again, like on the back end, the user of the tool will have to know the custodian or the mailbox each file goes with. So you would have to prepare that ahead of time, so you can pass it to the tool and say, this is the person for this file, and this is the person for that file, which may not be easy to do in some cases, but might be okay to do in others. So that's the second potential challenge there, I guess. Not really something that comes up all the time, especially if you're starting off with emails. This may not be an issue, but if you're starting off with other data outside of emails, could come up. The third issue, retention and holds and vault, right? So in a large organization, most of the time you're going to have Google Vault, and most people don't have Vault just for the sake of it. They use the litigation holds and the retention feature and all that stuff. Now, one of the challenges, it's good and bad, because Vault is a handy tool for exports, and a lot of people like using it. One of the difficulties on our end is that Google Vault has an API too, and it allows us to kind of at a high level manage the matters, searches, and exports there through Vault. But it doesn't give us direct access to a file in Vault. So we can't really tap into Vault as a data source and say, hey, I want to collect all the emails that are in Vault, or I want to target the Google Drive attachments in Vault. There is kind of like a closed box. So you can, from the outside, run a Vault export or a search or create a matter, but you can't really tap into Vault's held files or retained files that way. So that makes things a little bit complicated for a third-party application to deal with those held files. So the traditional approach we've had was to essentially run your FEC acquisitions for the stuff that's live now, but you would always have to complement that with a Vault export for anything that's held in Vault. And before, until recently, this was very uneven, because with FEC you would get a whole lot of stuff, but with Vault you don't have the Google Drive attachments. You were missing a lot of stuff, so that part was lacking pretty severely. Now, recently Google upped the ante a little bit, and they have a new feature to include hyperlinked Google Drive files as part of a Vault export. So that's a really nice feature that a lot of people have been waiting for. So when you toggle that switch, when you export your emails, you do get the Google Drive attachments, let's say the Google Drive files, not the revisions, but the files, along with your Vault export. So that was, you might feel like, well, that's competition for FEC, but we kind of embrace that, and we love it because it's actually a good way to get the job done. So we implemented some features to work with that, because one thing that Vault's export that way is lacking is that it's not immediately ingestion ready, right? They're exporting those things, but there's no direct context and correlation between the drive attachments and the emails. They are exported as like a individual instance for each Google Drive file, but they're not tied to the emails. There's no bundling or parent-child relationship immediately. So you would either have to, like we talked about earlier, have an e-discovery tool that recognizes that directly and does the magic to make it work, or you would have to have a bunch of intermediate steps to get there. So that's what we did with FEC. We essentially treat Vault as a additional virtual service provider in a way, where FEC can target a Vault export and act like that data is coming from the API in a way, and then reorganize that and gets you something that's almost exactly the same as if you'd done a direct FEC acquisition with the API. So with the bundling, foldering by labels and all that stuff, like PSD output, everything you would want. So that solves most of the problems there, and I think a great step in the right direction. One thing that's still lacking though is the revisions, because they don't export revisions.
Right.
We don't have a way to include that out of the blue. So there are a couple of ways around that. Hopefully what will happen is Google will get there eventually. If that happens, then that's the easiest path, right?
Sure.
Least resistance. We can just take that and run with it and adapt our tool to include the revisions as well. If they don't get there in a reasonably fast manner, then what we might have to do is we might have to do like a hybrid approach, where we start with the Vault export, get the drive files from there, and then get the drive revisions from the API directly if they're available. Now,
Right.
there's still the complication of if that file is only in Vault and held, then we still can't get that. But if the file happens to be live, then at least we can get the revisions for those. So ideally,
Okay.
Google does it, and it'll be easier for everyone. If
Sure.
we have a backup
Right.
plan to
So
handle
I'm envisioning a scenario, Armand, where you've got an organization that uses G Suite and they decide, okay, we have to put some, some custodians on hold, so their data is in Vault. In a way, then they're actually assuming that data eventually disappears from Drive, or some of it does. They're actually making less data. They're putting on hold some of the data, but not really all the data. They're not putting on hold the revisions. So they're putting on hold kind of gives you less data available for collection. Is that a fair way to put it?
I think so. I think, from Google's perspective, the revisions and everything is probably still there. But as far as accessibility from the outside, yeah, there's definitely a limit there. Once it's on hold, the accessibility to revisions becomes challenging, at least through the API. Maybe from their own user interface, you might have some ways to individual look at stuff, but yeah, it definitely curtails what we could do automatically in a batch export scenario.
Okay. All right.
There's one other issue that's related to Vault, which is again not very common, and likely this didn't catch on as much as I feared, but they had the confidential mode stuff that came out a couple of years ago. So
Yeah.
if you turn that on as an organization, then there could be some files or emails that are not directly available through API, because if you download them, essentially you get to a gate. You would have to authenticate to get in and actually access the decrypted message. So that's another thing where, a Vault export would include those and get you the actual data. Whereas if you access through the API, there is no mechanism to decrypt them on the fly and get to the actual contents. Luckily, it is possible to identify those files with a search. We call this an in-place search. So you run a search against Google, let's say Gmail or Drive, before you perform an acquisition. So if you run a quick search like that prior to your acquisition, those confidential mode files have a special label. So you can search for that label to see if that applies to your target at all. If it does, then well, we probably got to complement this with a Vault export to just get those files. If it's not there, no big deal. And going back to your question about what an organization could do, this is probably one of the things to watch out for. If you're taking steps to make things a little more difficult to access, that cuts both ways, right? In terms of retention and e-disclosure, then you're making it a lot difficult to bring in third-party tools to access that stuff because it's only available through Vault now, and you don't have any other options that could give you some usability improvements.
So if you were advising a client, especially a corporate client, about their backup and archive tools, would you advise something other than Google Vault?
No, Google Vault is a good solution. I would recommend them to use Google Vault if they're in the Google environment. But I would advise them to be careful about implementing confidential mode. And now there's another Google feature called end-to-end encryption, which makes it difficult in a different way. Then Google Vault can't even search contents of the files because they don't have access to the decrypted message bodies and attachments and stuff. So that's another potential roadblock. And you can't really issue a blanket recommendation like that because it depends on the business case, right? If you have a very highly regulated business or something that's out of the ordinary, then you might make a case that something like that is warranted, and then maybe you would have the internal development manpower to find a solution to that yourself, and then you're good. But for an ordinary business that's just doing regular stuff, it's probably not the best idea to go that far unless you have an existing solution. You don't want to implement that without a solution and then find yourself in a lawsuit where you just don't know how to get to those documents. Now that's a bad spot.
Right. Makes sense. So,
You mentioned, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
All right. So one of the cases we covered last year, well, actually last year and this year, because it had two different rulings, was the StubHub case. And as I understand it, they had kind of a hybrid system. They had basically, I think, Exchange for their emails and Google Drive for their office files and what have you. So it was kind of a mixed approach there. Any challenges that, I mean, are you still able to, because it's my understanding FEC does work with Exchange. Can you, do you still have the ability to tap into and use the Google API from there to collect those files, even though they're not from Gmail?
That's definitely an extra challenge. Right now, we don't. The idea here is
Okay.
that currently the universes are separate in our product. So you enter the Google realm and you're there, whereas Exchange
Makes
is a whole.
perfect sense. Yeah.
But we are looking to decouple the modern attachment section and make it a different layer because, like I was saying earlier, you could even have more in the mix, like Dropbox and Box.com and anything, any combination. So we should be able to have a separate layer that just handles the modern attachments. So you should be able to authenticate as multiple things. So you get into Exchange for the emails, and then let's say you authenticate as Dropbox and Box and Google to handle the modern attachments as they come. So that kind of decoupling would be nice. That's definitely something we had in mind from the get-go, but it's like a future iteration.
Right. Sure. Yeah, not easier said than done, right? So
Right.
yeah, I get that.
Okay. Well, I obviously we could talk about this for a whole lot longer, but we're kind of running out of time here. Any overview words of wisdom that you'd like to say about this whole thing, Arman? And I mean, after listening to you for an hour, my advice is somebody has Gmail, they should just call you. Right? But you said that, I guess the one question I would ask, you said that especially a corporation with a robust IT department, they could build this in-house. Have you seen anybody doing that? I'm not naming names, but isn't it still just easier to call you?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, it's not when it comes to implementing something like this, there's a lot of detail. So it's not going to be really cost effective most of the time to do something like this when there's a tool that's already there at a reasonable price. So most of the time, probably doesn't make sense. Back in the day when we were first starting this, I think that was at least one consulting firm that did like a simplistic version of something like this with Google. So it wasn't unheard of. But I don't know any firms or any consulting companies that have their own solution to this. There might be. I'm not aware of it. But yeah, I would say, the devil is in the details, right? When you get into the details with, throttling and the different export formats, the fallbacks to different mechanisms of retrieval, revisions, and Google Drive folders and stuff like that, there's quite a bit to do there and hard to get it all right in a small time frame. We've been at this for Metaspike has been around for 7 years, but the Drive stuff we started 5 years ago. And I remember I was talking to Doug about this because he had some conference appearances coming up about the same stuff. So 5 years, and we still have a to-do list on this.
Well,
yeah,
it's changing constantly, right? I mean, I know at least on the Microsoft Exchange end, it seems like every week they come out with something new. And even a minor tweak can be something major for you in terms of going and grabbing that and putting it into your workflow. Yeah, that's one of the real problems I see is we saw it with some of these cases. The lawyers file a brief and they say this can't be done, but by the time the judge reads it and they have a hearing and it gets published, well, yeah, it can be done.
Yeah, and the needs change because 5 years ago there was no brief like that most of the time. People were unaware of the possibility. So unless we talked to them and somebody explained, hey, there's this possibility or gotcha too, they would just like gloss over that and not even take it into consideration.
Great point. That's a great point.
Thanks to Doug and and you and a lot of other pioneers, it's become a lot better known, so people know that there is this concept of modern attachments. And
well, you know what they say about pioneers. You can tell who the pioneers are because they got the arrows in their back.
Right. True. Well, and I think, I mean, that's one of the things. Hyperlinks to files have been in emails as long as there have been emails, but the volume is so much more now because we've moved to the cloud so much. So to me, that's why I think this has become an issue. I mean, yeah, we're talking about it and so forth, but we're also, a key indicator is when you start seeing these disputes come up in case law. And we saw one case in 2019, we saw one case in 2021, we saw 2 last year, we've seen 4 already this year, and that's a sign that it's getting more and more a common issue. And certainly the industry is very divided on exactly how it should be handled, which is really kind of interesting to see how things will develop. But certainly your product keeps coming up as a solution in these cases, which is obviously a reflection on just what a great job you all have done.
Yeah. Yeah. No, this has been and a great explanation. That was a really great
Absolutely.
discussion. You know, part of our problem in talking about this stuff is we don't have that overview. We don't understand that. And even some of the exceptions you mentioned, right? You know, talking about things like the confidential mode or the end-to-end encryption. I mean, things like that keep coming up and change the ground rules. So really
Yeah.
want to thank you for your time. This has been most illuminating, and I wish you success dealing with this going forward, because better you than me, brother.
Well,
This
thank you
is
guys. It
I
was a
don't think
pleasure.
it's going to get easier. I think it's going to get more complicated. And as Doug said, but we're going to hear more and more arguments about it. So thanks so much for your time and
Yes, thanks, Arman.
and your illumination. This has been really a great exposition of a really difficult subject. So thanks so much. And thanks everybody for listening. We'll see you next time on the eDiscovery channel.